In January 1944, the United States Army Air Force introduced the North American P-51D Mustang as a long-range escort fighter designed to be able to escort heavy bombers into every corner of Europe. Prior to its introduction, Germany was being bombed into rubble. However, the bombers with limited fighter escort were not unchallenged and were suffering unsustainable losses. In July 1944, Germany introduced the first operational jet fighter bomber in history, the Messerschmitt Me-262. At over 100 miles per hour faster than the Mustang's 440 miles per hour and its 430mm cannon, it was a devastating weapon against American bombers. In one of these engagements, a young American fighter pilot and a young German ace came together in an event that would start a long road ending in a great friendship. Who was Colonel Joseph Peterbos? Who was Oberleutnant Walter Schuck? How did they first meet? What would make two former enemies come together decades later and become great friends? Hello, I'm Colin Heaton, a veteran of the United States Army and Marine Corps, former history professor, book author, and welcome to this episode of Forgotten History. On April 10, 1945, the 8th Air Force launched hundreds of heavy bombers on a mission to strike deep into Germany. Hundreds of Allied fighters flew as escorts to protect the bombers from the expected attacks by Messerschmitt 109s, Focke-Wulf 190s, and, especially, Messerschmitt 262 jets. The Luftwaffe fighter pilots in the Reichsverteidigung, or Home Defense Forces, received the alerts of incoming enemy aircraft. German fighter pilots took off to intercept these formations. The German general of the fighters, Adolf Galland, had developed a layered belt defense method. Fighters would take off in stages, engaging the enemy, then returning to rearm and refuel as other fighters took their places. Sometimes hundreds of fighters would be overlapping each other, keeping the bomber formations under constant attack. One of these pilots was Oberleutnant Walter Schuck, commander of 3rd Staffel, 1st Group, Jagdgeschwader 7, flying the Me-262 turbojets out of Oranienburg. Schuck was a seasoned veteran of the Eastern Front and the Arctic fronts in Norway and Finland, and had well over 500 missions. For example, on June 17, 1944, he recorded 12 of his 206 aerial combat victories in a single day. He recalled the mission when his unit encountered the bombers near Oranienburg. We were alerted to a large bomber group, and we took off. I was the leader of my group, as we had 7 Me-262s, and as we reached altitude, around 6,000 meters, we saw them. I called out the lower left group and pushed the stick forward. I was coming in from the 7 o'clock position, when the nearest B-17 grew rapidly in size in front of my windscreen, and I pressed the firing button. The 30mm cannons hammered, and in the next moment the whole giant tail fin of the bomber was dissolved by the exploding shells. I had to pull up to avoid a collision as my Me-262 raced through the bomber formation. With my compatriot still in tow, I aimed at the wing of a bomber in another formation. A quick burst of fire, and as I pulled up to avoid a collision, I caught a glimpse of the B-17 going down in flames. It was the 303rd Bomb Group's B-17G, serial number 44-8427, call code VKE. It had been baptized Hen's Revenge in honor of the tail gunner, Sergeant Thomas Hen, who had been severely injured by AAA shrapnel in January 1945. The pilot, First Lieutenant Robert Boss Murray, was piloting the ship on its 22nd combat mission when the 30mm shells slammed into 2 right engines. Schuck continued. I then led my group into another formation of B-17s. Again, I aimed at the engines and opened fire at one of the bombers. The impact of the 30mm cannons was terrible. The giant bomber immediately slopped over and went down. On my next attack, the 30mm cannons immediately set the bomber on fire, and then one of the wings was torn off, making this my 4th kill in succession. One of these fighter pilots escorting the bombers was American 20-year-old First Lieutenant Joseph Anthony Peterbos of the 55th Fighter Squadron, 20th Fighter Group, in his P-51D, which he named Josephine for his fiancée, and he was on his 49th combat mission. He was flying high cover some 5,000 feet above the bombers, and just as the bombers were dropping their bombs, a swarm of Me-262s came barreling into the formation. Peterborough visually locked onto one, slicing through the bomber formation. Then he saw the 262 blow up a B-17 and start to close on his second B-17. Joe rolled over and started down at him. With his 5,000-foot altitude advantage and throttle wide open, he closed fast. And as he passed through 20,000 feet, his airspeed indicated 420 miles per hour. The 262 made its second kill that Joe could see as he was pulling into its 6 o'clock position with guns blazing away. Joe got several good hits on the 262's left wing and saw some smoke and fire. It went into a rolling turn with Joe in hot pursuit and headed for the deck. As Joe lost his speed advantage, the 262 pulled out of range, disappearing into a cloud bank. As he ended the chase, Joe saw an airfield loaded with enemy aircraft below him and proceeded to strafe it, destroying 5 enemy aircraft on the ground and setting a hangar on fire. On his final strafing run, his Mustang was severely damaged. However, he was able to nurse it back to Berg, Germany. At that time, he was at about 500 feet getting ready to bail out when he saw an FW-190 coming at him at his 3 o'clock. The 190 was firing his guns, and a volley of rockets had been fired, which fortunately missed. At this time, Joe was at 350 feet and immediately bailed out, rolling off the left side of the cockpit. As he left the aircraft, his right knee hit the horizontal stabilizer. He pulled the ripcord, the chute opened, and he hit the ground. He was immediately captured and endured an 80-mile forced march to Luckenwalde near Berlin, interred as a POW, escaped, and joined a Russian tank unit, which fought from Berlin to Wittenberg on the Elbe, where Joe was repatriated by a U.S. Army patrol that was in the area. What Peterborough did not know was that the Me-262 pilot was one of Germany's best aces, Knight's Cross and No-Please recipient Walter Schuck, already with 202 victories before this mission. What he also did not know was that this bomber was Schuck's 4th victory on that mission, with 40 men either killed or bailing out to be captured. Schuck's victories on that mission came quickly, at 14:30 hours, 14:33, 14:36, and the last at 14:38. One of the bombers was, of course, confirmed to be Hen's Revenge. The other bomber, his last, was Moonlight Mission of the 457th Bombardment Group. Walter Schuck tells of how his mission ended for him. Just when I shot down the 4th bomber, I was attacked from astern by a Mustang, which came in from above. I noticed some hits in the left wing and turned it to the right in a shallow dive, with the Mustang pursuing me. I passed Berlin, and after a while the left engine started to emit smoke. I then entered a low cloud bank, and as I turned my head, I could see that I had managed to get away from the Mustang. With the engine starting to disintegrate, I decided to leave that flaming coffin, but I wanted to be low enough to avoid hanging in my parachute for a long time, because some of our pilots had been shot as they slowly drifted down. I did not like that idea. My first attempt to get out failed. The air current was too strong. I pulled the stick back and climbed from 1,500 meters to 1,800 meters. Then I grabbed the handle with both hands, and with one foot I kicked the stick to one corner of the cockpit. The result was that the 262 tipped its nose and I was flying out of the cabin. Floating in the airspace, I entered a flat spin. As I rotated, my right arm extended 90 degrees from my body, and the G-forces were too strong to permit me to pull it back. Only by grabbing the sleeve of my leather jacket with my left hand was I able to pull my right arm back, so that I could pull the handle which enveloped the parachute. In the meantime, I had descended to only about 500 meters altitude. The jerk when the parachute unfolded above my head came only a few meters above the ground. Looking down, I could see a field with a barbed wire fence which came closer and closer. Desperately, I kicked in the air and pulled on the strings of the parachute. The parachute tipped over, and I barely dived over the barbed wire. I flung my feet forward and vitally hit the ground, spraining both ankles. Although I was in a state of shock, I quickly pulled the parachute together. I had heard that the American fighter pilots would come down and strafe bailed-out pilots, aiming at their white parachutes. Then I just lay down. Both men wondered who the other pilot was, especially Joe Peterborough. In the late 1990s, Joe received a letter from Werner Dietrich from Berg, Germany. He said he had arranged the excavation of a P-51 that crashed at his town in April 1945 and has been searching for over 19 months for the pilot. As Joe states himself, he was about to abandon the search when he got one possible lead. He was told that the 20th Fighter Group lost several aircraft that day in that area and that he should contact the 20th Fighter Group Association's president, Jack Ilfrey. Upon receiving Werner's letter, Jack immediately wrote back, "Hell yes, I know the pilot. It's Joe Peterborough living in Colorado Springs, Colorado." With my name and address in hand, Werner wrote me the letter I mentioned earlier, asking if I needed any more information and if I was indeed the pilot of the P-51 he saw when he was a boy. I responded yes, and 19 months after Werner's project began, he was able to locate the pilot. The problem with the official records was that they had my name spelled wrong, Peter Berg instead of Peter Burse, and that did not correlate. After being able to identify me, he went back to the TV producer who arranged the excavation. The producer was overjoyed and wanted Joe to come to Germany and visit the site and make a follow-up documentary. However, Joe's wife Josephine had a stroke in 1997, and he could not and would not leave her side. The TV producer then planned for Werner and the TV crew to visit Joe in Colorado Springs, bringing along parts of his aircraft. To quote Joe, "They arrived on 3 May 1997 with a beautiful bouquet of roses for Josephine and parts of my aircraft. I took them on a tour of the Air Force Academy as well as Pikes Peak, with a lot of hours discussing the 10 April 1945 mission. Of course, what Werner had seen as a boy was only part of my story. I told him of our raid on Oranienburg, my engagement with an Me-262, strafing of the airfield, and the subsequent damage to my aircraft, trying to make it back to the lines and eventually bailing out, where Werner came into the picture. After hearing these details, Werner became obsessed with the idea that he could find the Me-262 pilot that I had engaged. When he returned home to Germany, he relentlessly researched the records and eventually and miraculously found the Me-262 pilot that Joe had attacked. He is Oberleutnant Walter Schuck, one of Germany's top aces with 206 victories in the air. Joe Peterborough had long since retired from the U.S. Air Force, serving also in Korea and Vietnam, retiring as a colonel, easing into his golden years with his beloved wife Josephine until she passed away. In 2004, I, your humble narrator, was contacted by someone in Germany, perhaps the same man, Werner, who wanted to know if I knew which German jet unit was involved and who had been shot down over Oranienburg on that day. I checked my records, knowing several former JG-7 jet pilots and looking over old interviews with Schuck and the others, and looking at loss records for both the Americans and Germans, and I passed this information along. I was not so sure where it would go. But in 2005, Joe was invited to a gathering in Vista, California, from the 15th to the 20th of May 2005. Walter Schuck was coming to California to visit his old friend Kurt Schulze, his wingman and compadre in JG-5 Izmir, to sign some prints and meet two more of the old bold pilots who had served in combat together in the skies over Germany some 60 years earlier. The greatest thing about their meeting was that Walter and Joe, when they met, took to each other almost immediately. They genuinely liked each other and became the best of friends. The photograph here shows Walter on the left, Joe on the right, and a former Luftwaffe fighter pilot and squadron mate of Walter's in JG-5, Kurt Schulze, who organized the meeting. Walter held no ill will at all. In fact, Walter even admitted that being injured in the jump from his jet probably saved his life, since he was unable to continue flying. Joe and Walter immediately became close friends, and both did several respective on-camera interviews and TV shows and podcasts over the years. Walter Schuck's autobiography, Luftwaffe Eagle, is worthwhile reading, and both men and many others are covered in my book, The Me-262 Stormbird, with a foreword written by Joe Peterborough and Me-262 pilot Oberleutnant Jörg Czapjanka. I was very fortunate to have become friends with both of these men and many other pilots, and Walter Schuck, unfortunately, passed away on March 27, 2015, but he is still remembered by his family, his friends, and one Joe Peterborough. Thank you for watching Forgotten History. Please click like, subscribe, and share. Send us comments and show ideas, and we will get back to you as soon as possible. Until next time.